From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
911, what is your emergency?
Well, I'm wondering about this anhydrous.
Sir, you stay in your home, treat it like smoke, turn your furnace off, put towels underneath the doors, go in your bathroom, turn the shower on, and cover your face with wet towels.
Okay.
And stay there until further instructions by law enforcement.
Okay, because the PA system doesn't work in it.
I understand that, and also we've been putting it out over the cable TV and the radio.
Which radio station?
All the radio stations, sir.
I've had it on, I haven't heard it.
Today, a Democracy Now! Exclusive. 5 years ago this week, a train derailed in Minot, North Dakota, leaking thousands of gallons of toxic chemicals. One person died, hundreds were hospitalized. The city's 6 non-religious commercial radio stations were all owned by Clear Channel. They never aired warnings for local residents. When gasping for air means fighting for air. We broadcast for the first time the 9/11 tapes. We'll speak with sociologist Eric Kleinenberg about the battle to control America's media. Then President Bush calls for immigration reform in his State of the Union address.
We need to resolve the status of the illegal immigrants who are already in our country without animosity and without amnesty.
Targeted, Homeland Security, and the business of immigration. We'll speak with author Deepa Fernandez about her new book. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Democrats won their first measure against the Iraq War Wednesday when the Senate Foreign Relations Committee approved a non-binding resolution calling the troop increase, quote, not in the national interest. The final vote was 12-9. Senator Chuck Hagel of Nebraska was the lone Republican to vote along with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee's 11 Democrats.
There is no strategy. This is a ping pong game with American lives. These young men and women that we put in Anbar province, in Iraq, in Baghdad are not beans. They're real lives. And we better be damn sure we know what we're doing, all of us, before we put 22,000 more Americans into that grinder.
The resolution is expected to reach the Senate floor next week. At an appearance in Delaware, President Bush repeated calls for bipartisan support.
It doesn't matter what side of the aisle we sit on. What the American people expect is for people on both sides of the aisle to come together and solve problems.
Meanwhile, Iraq is topping the agenda today at the gathering of world leaders in Davos, Switzerland. Iraqi parliament member Adnan Pachachi addressed the growing political opposition to the Iraq war in the United States.
If, because of domestic pressures in the United States will feel it's not possible for them to continue undertaking this burden, then I think we should consider the possibility of internationalizing the whole thing and go to the United Nations and have a restructured multinational force under the United Nations authority.
Adnan Pachachi speaking at the World Economic Forum. In Lebanon, calm is slowly returning to the capital Beirut 2 days after the opposition-led general strike. On Wednesday, Hezbollah leader Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah said the opposition could have overthrown the government but stopped short to avoid civil strife.
The opposition is able. I'm not exaggerating when I say this. The opposition has the political force, the mobility, the crowds, and the strong will, the ability to make decisions, and the ability to plan and act. If the opposition wanted to topple the government, it would have done so on the first day of its protest.
Meanwhile, at a donor meeting in Paris today, the Bush administration announced plans to triple aid to the Lebanese Prime Minister Fouad Siniora. Back in the United States, 9 former Black Panthers have been arrested and charged for a 35-year-old murder case that was originally dismissed because police had obtained confessions through torture. The case centers around the killing of a San Francisco police officer in 1971. 3 of the former Panthers were cleared of wrongdoing in 1975 after it was revealed police used torture to extract their confessions. The men were beaten, stripped naked, blindfolded, had electric probes applied to their genitals. The new arrests are drawing intense criticism. Attorney Kamal Franklin of the Center for Constitutional Rights said, quote, "These indictments are an attempt to rewrite history, the history of the Black Panthers, the history of COINTELPRO, and the history of the Civil Rights Movement." In Mississippi, a former sheriff's deputy and reported Ku Klux Klan member has been arrested in one of the last major unsolved murder cases of the Civil Rights era. James Ford Steele has been charged with a 1964 kidnapping of two 19-year-old African-American hitchhikers who were beaten and dumped alive into the Mississippi River. Steele's family claimed he was deceased after investigators reopened the case 7 years ago. But efforts by one of the victims' brothers revealed Steele was alive and still living down the road from where the kidnappings occurred. Here in New York, a survivor of the police shooting that killed the unarmed Queens man, Sean Bell, on the day of his wedding, has been released from the hospital. Joseph Guzman is still in a wheelchair recovering from 16 bullet wounds. He still has 5 bullets in his body. At a news conference in Harlem Wednesday, Guzman said the police officer should be held accountable for shooting him and his friends. A grand jury investigation is continuing with no indictments to date. In military news, the Pentagon unveiled a new weapon Wednesday that gives targets the sensation they're about to catch fire. The ray gun was displayed at a media demonstration where people pretended to take part in a riot. The weapon isn't expected to go into production for another 3 years. In election news, Democratic Senator and former presidential candidate John Kerry has announced he will not seek the Democratic presidential nomination in 2008. In Ohio, 2 election workers were convicted Wednesday of rigging a recount of the 2004 presidential election. The workers oversaw balloting in Ohio's Cuyahoga County. Prosecutors say they secretly vetted ballots before a public recount took place. The tampering did not affect the final outcome of the Ohio vote, but critics say was part of a broader wave of electoral misconduct. Former President Jimmy Carter has announced he'll change a sentence in his new book, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid, that indicates Palestinians should not be expected to end suicide bombings until Israel withdraws settlements from the occupied territories. Speaking at Brandeis University Tuesday, Carter said the sentence was worded in a, quote, completely improper and stupid way and would be changed in new editions. But Carter refused calls to retract other claims in his book, including his comparison of Israeli practices in the occupied territories to South Africa under apartheid. Attorneys for the jailed independent journalist Josh Wolf have launched a new effort for his release. Wolf was sent back to prison last year after refusing a court order to hand over video of a protest in San Francisco. His lawyers have filed what's called a Grumbles motion. The motion argues Wolf's commitment to press freedom will forever prevent him from handing over the tape. Wolf would be released if the court rules keeping him in jail would only be punitive. Wolf has spent more than 150 days in prison. You can go to our website at DemocracyNow.org to hear and watch our interview with Josh Wolf when he was let out of jail for a little while. In Florida, jailed University of South Florida Professor Sami Alarian has begun the second hunger strike of his time in prison. Alarian has been accused of links to the Palestinian militant group Islamic Jihad. He's been jailed over 3 years, despite the fact the jury in his case failed to return a single guilty verdict on any of the charges brought against him. And finally, a correction to a headline from yesterday's broadcast about newly freed prisoner Roy Brown. Brown was exonerated of his rape and murder conviction not by DNA testing on the boyfriend of the victim, but by DNA testing on the boyfriend's brother. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
And welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.